During the 2020 to 2021 lockdown, there was a lot of discourse around productivity, useful things that you could do when you weren't allowed to go outside. I didn't do any of them. Like a lot of people, I struggled to read or write or do any of those things. I don't even like banana bread that much. What I did was watch a lot of TV, and like many other places all around the world, the most popular shows that I watched weren't made in this country, but were American. And the more that I watched, the more something strange about it came to mind. I found myself asking, how do we end up with this? And to answer that question, to do cultural criticism is to reckon with the fact that this has to happen retroactively. The need to understand the present has to be processed historically. What's important to point out is this is a two-way process. Cultural objects are formed by historical forces and events, but these have their own impact back onto the kind of culture that gets produced. So through careful attention to cultural texts, you can see the impact of history and politics on what is so often presented as being just culture. And over the last 20 years or so, probably the most formative historical event on American popular culture was the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. It produced some weird and deeply awful cultural texts, but it had a much more nebulous impact too. To understand how genre TV ended up the way that it is, you have to reckon with the fact that it's produced in the wake of history, which determines what gets made and what that's trying to say. To that end, this is the first in an ongoing series of videos about American television as diagnostic, a means to think about how American culture came to look the way that it did through some of its most successful and popular television programs, and to explore how those television programs reflect and construct the ideologies circulating in American culture today. This is the show I've watched more than any other during the last year. Like a lot of high-end American television, it's slick, it's well-made, and well-produced. It is almost compulsively watchable. It's also absolutely amazing. If you've never seen it, the show follows a team of criminal profilers who work for the Behavioral Analysis Unit of the FBI. Each episode opens with a crime, then follows the investigation as the team of profilers use their psychological techniques and the powers of the federal government to find the unknown subject, or unsub. The action generally reaches a high point in the last 10 minutes of each episode when the team realizes who the unsub is and that this person is about to kill again. There's a standoff with the agents and the unsub is either killed or arrested. Along the way, as each season develops, we get more insight into the personal lives of the profilers and the various conflicts and issues they all face, as well as the psychological toll that investigating these crimes takes on the team. It was and is an incredibly popular show, watched by millions of people. And it raises some really interesting questions. Watching the show, you have to wonder what kind of show this is, what is it trying to do, and how is the show working through some of the wider issues in culture at the time. The question of what kind of show this is might initially seem kind of obvious. It's a police procedural, right? Well, yes. But also, no. Let me explain. You see, genre is not intrinsic to a text. The categories are not that clear-cut. It emerges historically. It's made up of things like marketing, shared associations of style, history, and of course, the influence upon one show on the next. How we decide to use genre and which kind of texts get classified into which kind of genre tells us a lot about issues of periodization and taxonomy. Genre distinctions are not just about how texts are marketed, but about how texts are understood. The academic Jonathan Nichols-Pethick described the police procedural like this.
More traditional police series typically follow a closed episodic structure in which all major narrative threads, usually one particular case in a secondary narrative, are resolved by the end of each episode. These series tend to rely heavily on one of two primary formulas of the detective genre. The first we might call swift justice model, in which the perpetrator is known from the outset and the job of the police is to apprehend him or her. This form typically relies on heightened action sequences, especially in car chases, fistfights, and gun battles to bring about closure to the narrative. The second structure is simply the whodunit model, in which the criminal is unknown and the role of the police detective, using his or her superior sleuthing abilities, is to solve the mystery. Because these series rely so heavily on these recognisable structures and tend towards closure, they're often dismissed as trite, predictable escapism, sensationalist exploitation, or in the worst cases, politically reactionary dogma, not to be taken seriously.
And yeah, the dogma is there. The famous literary critic Svetan Todorov said that the whodunit generally has two stories. First, there's the story of the crime, which can even happen before the narrative actually starts, and the second is the story of detection. From the outset, it's clear that Criminal Minds is kind of a hybrid show. There are the two stories of Todorov, but it also fits into two categories that Nichols-Pethick points out. The last 5 or 10 minutes of each episode, when the team have figured out who the unknown subject is full of car chases and, of course, the obligatory shootout. The rest of each episode is essentially the story of detection, trying to work out who the criminal is and where they may strike next. So that's how the show fits into the classic taxonomy of the police procedural. But to understand how it differs, we have to ask another question. What is the whodunit for? In the first type, the swift justice model, you already know who the guilty person is. And in the second, the whole purpose is to follow along the deductive chain until you can discover who the criminal is. A whodunit should be about learning along with the characters. However, in Criminal Minds, that doesn't really happen. After all, until the last 10 minutes or so of each episode, you don't know who's done it. You only know what's been done. Frequently, in early episodes of the show, the solution comes in the form of an epiphany, as Jason Gideon realizes something about the case that unlocks the answer using his brain powers. In later seasons, the epiphany is still present, but is mediated or replaced by the use of very complex technology or the surveillance abilities of the federal government to break into websites or obtain information that otherwise would be impossible to get. What this means is that in many episodes, it is, in effect, impossible for you to follow along a deductive chain to arrive at a conclusion. Watching Criminal Minds is not about solving a mystery, but about watching somebody else do it for you again and again. Watching, we get to feel both protected and smart. Of course, this isn't unique to Criminal Minds. The closest point of comparison is probably something like CSI. It has a similar rational deductive methodology, but CSI chooses to lean into a sophisticated pseudo-pop science method to solve its crimes, whereas Criminal Minds uses psychological profiling and data collection. In effect, both shows make it impossible for you as a viewer to solve the crimes, simply because you don't have the specialist skills needed to do so. But both of them will provide you with friendly authority figures that you get to watch. And this is an important point. In many ways, Criminal Minds is a very traditional police procedural. However, it's also a kind of fantasy. What I mean by saying that is that reality is not unproblematically given, and that cultural texts stage and in some ways assemble culturally prevalent desires. The French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan said that fantasy can even have a protective function, like a horror movie that freezes on a scene just before the monster appears. Living internet meme and hot dog aficionado Slavoj Žižek builds upon Lacan and says that not even desire is a given. Visual media like film, like television, doesn't just show us what we want, but constructs desire in the first place.
The problem for us is not are our desires satisfied or not. The problem is how do we know what we desire? There is nothing spontaneous, nothing natural about human desire. Our desires are artificial. We have to be taught to desire. Cinema is the ultimate pervert art. It doesn't give you what you desire. It tells you how to desire.
And this is a helpful way to think about Criminal Minds. It's a personal drama full of upstanding, easily recognizable types, from human computer Dr. Spencer Reid to the stoic father figure Aaron Hotchner to the perfectly benevolent panopticon Penelope Garcia. They're there to keep us safe, to protect us, to ensure our freedoms. And what the fantasy demands of the viewer is staged in the show. Be known utterly, make yourself into a perfectly transparent subject. Don't you want to be free? Don't you want to be a free American? In which case, what have you got to hide? And of course, if you know anything about the history of the US intelligence agencies, particularly in the wake of September 11th, 2001, then you know you almost certainly are constantly observed, but not as a person, not as a known subject, but as a data point in computational networks of observation. But now you have the phantasmatic projections of the perfect people to watch over you as you watch them keep you safe. I wonder why that might be a prevalent cultural desire in the post 9/11 cultural imagination. Oh, I see. Of course, it isn't just the fantasy which makes the show so compelling. Fantasy cuts both ways. It has to be motivated by something. So if the show posits a perfectly transparent subject that can be known and protected by a all-seeing and benevolent FBI, this has to be motivated by something. And the best motivation that the show comes up with is fear. If you watch the show, you'll hear the word vigilance a lot, which is interesting because whilst the show is on the surface about the logical judicial response to serial crime, the show also seems to think that these crimes can happen to anyone, at any time, anywhere. Actually, the question of location is super interesting, and is another reason why the show doesn't fit neatly into the classic taxonomies of the police procedural. Generally, from a narrative point of view, police procedurals tend to be concerned with big cities. This makes sense. This is where you're probably likely to find the largest police force, and from a dramatic point of view, urban centres are where you find lots of different people and all of the issues that brings up. In contrast, Criminal Minds episodes can generally happen sort of everywhere. The serial murderer can strike anywhere. The show takes great pains to show that from the wilderness to the biggest urban centres, you are not now, nor will you ever be, completely safe. You or your spouse or your children or your friends or your family can become a victim on your commute, at work, at home, when you're in company or when you're alone. The unsub could be a doctor, a psychiatrist, a nurse, or even just that cute guy that you met at the coffee shop. There are so many scenes throughout the show of characters delivering this injunction to be vigilant to law enforcement officers, or in press conferences where we see it being broadcast into the homes of people watching, and by implication to us as well. And so I don't think it's too much of a stretch to connect those elements of the show to real-life cultural objects like this. There's a moment towards the beginning of the show's run which makes this very, very clear. In the episode P911, the characters from the BAU end up having to team up with the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit. The unit's leader explains the threat that they're up against like this.
They're getting smarter and smarter, and all the security in the world can't stop them from coming through our doors. Hell, the monsters are already in our homes.
Look! You fools! You're in danger! Can't you see? They're after you! They're after all of us! Our wives, our children, everyone! They're here already! You're next! You're next! You're next! You're next! You're next!
And in this moment, the show makes explicit what is so often left implicit. The monsters are here, the monsters are inside your house, and the only ones who can keep you safe, but just barely, are the FBI. This sense of paranoia is something that gets carried over into the development of the show's characters, too. Almost all of the main cast have a kind of nemesis, a multi-season or multi-episode engagement with a serial killer who is less criminal to be caught and more supervillain. There's even a long multi-season arc with a character called Mr. Scratch, who specializes in inducing hallucinations. You can be a virtuous paladin of the FBI, but you can't even trust your own perceptions of reality. Here's another example. In the very first season of the show, they introduced the character Jennifer Giroux, known as JJ. She's the team's press liaison officer. She handles the press conferences and offers some logistical support. In the course of the show, she becomes an FBI profiler, and then later she kills somebody in the line of duty for the first time, rationalizing it that you do whatever you have to protect your family. Deeper into the show, she leaves the team and ends up doing black bag work for the US State Department somewhere in the Middle East. It's a character arc exemplifying a generation that grew up in the post 9/11 age, surrounded by propaganda and paranoia, inculcated into a culture that expected them to become willing servants of the violent state, rationalizing it by you do anything you can to protect those you care about. When I first said I was going to do this, a lot of people suggested, why not talk about 24? It started broadcasting in 2001, and like Criminal Minds, it's about an omnipotent government going up against a series of almost impossible to defeat enemies and threats. However, Criminal Minds is about paranoia. 24 isn't. 24, especially in its earlier seasons, is about revenge. It was very critically well regarded and beloved by the political right in the US, even being quoted by Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia in cases about torture. However, it's Criminal Minds that's getting the reboot already. It would be really easy to dismiss this show, reactionary dogma that's not worth taking seriously, but this show and so many like it are incredibly popular. So, if we want to understand the cultural imagination of the present, we have to reckon with the libidinal pleasures of shows like this and the paranoid fantasies that it helps propagate and in some way constructs. We have to reckon with this show as both fantasy and symptom. Yet to do so takes us away from the text and forces us to confront our own involvement with these structures of fantasy that we are enmeshed within every time we turn on the TV. Thank you for watching.